Hey everyone, today I'm going to show you how to check and adjust the valves on any motorcycle with shim style adjusters. Tight valve clearances can lower compression and overheat valves, but you won't notice symptoms until expensive damage is already being done. We'll tackle the job on this KZ1000J series engine that uses shim over bucket adjusters, and I'll show you a great trick for pulling these shims using a zip tie instead of pulling the cams or buying an expensive tool like this. If you have a shim under bucket style engine, unfortunately the only way to get the shims out is by pulling the cams, but the rest of the process is essentially the same. Shim valves have the benefit of longer service intervals over the screw tappet style, but come at the cost of being a little more involved to adjust. Shim valves also tend to wear tight because over time the valve hammers itself further into the head, closing the gap between the tip of the valve and the cam. When this gets bad enough, the valve won't be able to fully seat, which causes compression leaks and doesn't let the valve dissipate heat into the head as efficiently, which will eventually burn the valve. This KZ has almost 40,000 miles on it, and it's safe to say it's gone over the 3,000 mile service interval for a valve check. To show how valve clearances can affect compression, I'll pull the numbers on all cylinders before doing the job to get a baseline. This was taken with the engine cold, so 120 to 130 psi is expected. But something is wrong with cylinder number 2. While 110 psi is well within the minimum spec to run, it is more than 10% lower than the highest compression number on cylinder number 4, which indicates a greater imbalance across the engine than is recommended. So after we adjust the valves, I'll check them again, and you might be surprised at the difference it makes. The first step to adjusting valves is disassembly. For most of these older bikes, you have to remove a few things like the coils and EGR to get enough clearance to pull the valve cover. There are only 4 different length valve cover bolts for these KZs. 4 medium length ones for each cam end, 4 really short and long ones for the EGR valves, and the rest are the same size and interchangeable. With those set aside, you should be able to pull the valve cover up enough to clear the cam chain and slide it out. The next step is to remove the spark plugs. The reason I wait until the valve cover is off to pull these is so that there's no chance of dropping a screw or getting debris knocked into a plug hole while removing everything else. Now pull the side cover to access the crank that we'll use to cycle the engine over by hand with a 17mm socket. At this point, we want to measure the clearance on each valve and write them all down. Make sure you do this when the engine is fully cooled down because thermal expansion will skew the measurements. I like to make a grid like this, and as I measure each valve, I'll record the largest feeler gauge size that will fit between the shim and cam lobe without enough force to flex the gauge very much. This, for example, is too tight. See how it's bending the feeler? It should slide in easily and have light drag as you pull the feeler gauge out. To get the cams into position to measure, Kawasaki has 2 conflicting instructions. The older way was to turn the crank until the cam lobe in question faces directly away from the shim and do that for each valve. Later, Kawasaki changed it to a few different crank positions where you can measure multiple valves at once, but they are not fully facing away from the shims. Depending on which way you do it, can yield slightly different results, but don't worry too much about it. Both ways work and will get you within spec. I personally prefer the older way of setting each lobe fully away from the shim. It just feels more consistent to me, although slightly less convenient. Once you've gotten all the clearances on paper, compare them to spec. For this bike, 0.05 to 0.1mm is spec for the intake valves and 0.1 to 0.15mm for the exhaust valves. So we can see here that on this bike, the valves that I need to reshim are the intake on number 2 and the exhaust valve on number 4. But I'm also going to do the exhaust valve on number 2 and the intake on number 3 since they're on the tight end of spec and I want to leave them on the loose end. This will make them last longer before the next adjustment. Also, I noticed that the number 2 intake had essentially 0 clearance because I couldn't get even my smallest gauge to fit, but I could spin the bucket freely, so it isn't holding the valve open when cold. However, as the engine warms up and clearances tighten, it very well could be leaking compression and overheating that valve, which we'll confirm later with the second compression test. To calculate what size shims are needed to achieve the desired clearance, we need to know the thickness of the old shims we're going to replace. This is where my special trick for easily pulling the shims comes in handy. All you need is a zip tie. Just fold it in half and put a little bend near the fold. Now rotate the engine until the cam lobe pushes down on the shim in question. Make sure to always turn it in the direction the engine runs. You'll see the valve appear through the spark plug hole. Take your custom zip tie valve adjusting tool and slide it into the spark plug hole under the protruding valve just like this. Rotate the engine again until the cam lobe is facing away from the shim. The zip tie will hold the valve open just enough to pull the shim out. A plastic zip tie is much softer than the valve components, so there's no risk of damaging anything while doing this. With the shim in hand, you can hopefully read the thickness stamped on the side that was facing down. However, they're often worn off, and in that case, you'll have to manually measure them with a caliper. Shims come in increments of 0.05 millimeters, so it should measure out to a round number like 2.35 millimeters or something like that. Make sure to return the shim back into the bucket before turning the engine to remove the zip tie, or else the cam lobe can get damaged contacting the sharp edge of the bucket. With the shim in place, turn the engine enough to free the zip tie and move on to the next until you have recorded all of the shim thicknesses that you need to change. If you have a shim kit and you can swap them out on the spot, then the math I'm about to show you can be done as you go. But in my case, I just ordered the shims I needed once they were all calculated, so I had to wait for them to come in the mail, and then I could pull them again to actually do the swap. Either way you do it, the math is simple. Here's the equation you'll need to figure out the new shim's thickness. Use the bigger number for desired clearance, and if the number you end up with is between shim sizes, I usually round down to err on the loose side of spec. So I did this math on all valves to be adjusted, and then ordered new shims on eBay. If you do this a lot, or you need to adjust all the valves, a shim kit might be worth looking into. In my case, I was able to just swap some of the old shims between valves, so I only needed to buy 3 new shims in the end. Once they arrived, I used the zip tie trick again to pop the old shims out, and I put the new ones in. It's worth noting that you can only do this zip tie trick on bikes with easily accessible spark plug holes. It works great for most air-cooled dual overhead cam bikes like the Honda CBs, Suzuki GSs, and KZs like this one here. But if your bike is liquid-cooled, the plugs are usually at the bottom of a long tube, and you won't be able to get a zip tie down in there. In those cases, buying or making a special tool to push the bucket down is your only option. But it still beats pulling the cams to adjust shim under bucket valves. With all that done, you can recheck the clearances and make sure that they're all within spec. Then button everything back up in the opposite order it was disassembled. Torque the 6mm valve cover bolts to 80 inch-pounds starting in the middle and working your way outward. That applies to most valve covers with 6mm bolts. If it weeps, you can go another 5 inch-pounds. After one heat cycle, I checked the compression again, and I got just over 120 psi on cylinder number 2. So that pretty well confirms that the tight intake valve on number 2 was causing about 10 psi of compression loss. And that was with it cold. It would have only gotten worse as it warmed up. This is exactly why valve clearance checks are so important. If this bike had kept going unserviced, it would have eventually burnt that valve. So check your valves and keep them in spec. And if you like this video, give us a follow or comment down below. We love hearing from you and we read every single one. I hope this helps and ride safe.